So today, what I want to talk about is something that I haven't talked much about, even with my peers and friends, because quite frankly, I know how it sounds. It sounds a bit like an exaggeration, but I do mean it in its most sincere way. It's a thought that I've had for quite a few months now, especially after observing the GameStop phenomenon. But it also ties into the whole Black Lives Matter movement and critical race theory in general. So I do believe that there's a Marxist like cultural revolution that's in progress in its infancy in the United States and the West more broadly speaking. So let's take the Black Lives Matter movement for example, which was created in 2000, started in 2013, got a lot of traction and attention in 2020 after death of George Floyd. Protests and riots erupted across the country protesting this supposed systemic racism and police brutality, white privilege, with an emphasis on how it's disproportionately affected blacks. Now, if you look at the data, for example, USA Today uses the post data. Total of 13 unarmed black men were killed or fatally shot by police officers in 2019, right? Um, and well, this article is a little dated, July 2020, but that was during the time when the height of the protests and riots, Black Lives Matter riots. Um, but as of July 2020, I don't know what the international number is, but just in the United States alone, 25 people have already been killed during these protests and political unrest. In addition to that, estimated up to potentially $2 billion of damages have already been incurred from the riots and looting. So at this point, personally, I find it a little difficult to support and justify this movement, especially when it comes to the violent riots and looting. But what's more troublesome than that, than this is, I think, if you look at it, there's a palpable energy, an undercurrent of anger beneath this. Um, there's a desire for justice, which I can empathize with and completely understand because when you watch these videos of police brutality, it gets you in it from an emotional perspective too. But I think that that's not really the problem because I think that's very natural. First, first of all, but I think what's problematic here is that there's no appetite to have a genuine discussion about it, to talk about, to get down to the truth, to look at statistics. The whole narrative has predominantly been taken over by anecdotal evidence with specific stories, and a lot of the information that's being propagated and consumed by people, especially people who are supporting Black Lives Matter, are just memes and 15-second TikTok videos, which I don't think does justice to the topics that we are discussing today and the problems that are plaguing this community because they are not, as much as we want a simple answer to them, they're not that simple. A lot of these things, when we're talking about wealth disparity, when we're talking about disproportionate amount of blacks being killed than whites by police officers, things like that, the reasons are usually, most definitely, multi-factored. But there does not seem to be a desire to discuss it as such. In fact, what seems like what it seems like is people want to use a broad brush and paint over everything and just call it systemic racism, which is a word I don't like. First of all, because I think it obfuscates and makes things a little murky. But when we're talking about things like this, that's right. There does very well seem to be a desire to just paint over everything and say it's systemic racism. and nothing else. And we don't want to talk about the other factors. And I think not only is that not going to bring any lasting solutions for these to these issues, but it's just disingenuous. For example, one of the things that you see being passed around a lot on social media is how black men are killed 3 times more than white men. Black men, right? Black men are killed 3 times more than white men by police officers after adjusting for population. But what people that you don't see is that when you take out the armed suspects and when you just include unarmed individuals, that number drops down to 1.3. So it's still higher, but it's 1.3. Unarmed black men are 1.3 times more likely to be killed than an unarmed white man. And the reason why I think it's important to point that out is because at the end of the day, we're really looking at unjustified killing, shootings, or from police officers, right? We don't really want to include statistics in there where someone's an armed suspect and potentially even shooting back at the police. But the fact that people like to talk about that or pass around that three times more number and just clump in the armed suspects, I think is just intentionally misleading, and it does not help us get down to solving the root problem. In fact, it's just all it's good for is just elicit a stronger emotional response and create more anger. The other thing that you don't hear people talk about is when it comes to this, sometimes you always see comparisons between blacks and whites. Sometimes you see comparisons of the Hispanic population as well, but they never talk about Asians, because Asians, in fact, are killed at a lower percentage than even whites after adjusting for population, which should tell you that when it comes to even police brutality or when it comes to wealth disparity, there's more to it than simply race. There's more to it than white supremacy or white privilege, is what I'm trying to say. But again, there's no desire to talk about it. People just were cherry picking data points that we want to talk about it. We're even deliberately choosing data points that are misleading to helping us identify the root problem to all this. Because the anger is so strong there that we want to get revenge, the feeling of anger and the desire to get revenge is so strong that people are just clumping together and become this sort of mob mentality where we're not really critically thinking anymore, nor are we trying to generally have genuine discussions to find real solutions to the problem. And if you cannot discuss these issues from an honest and genuine perspective, you're not going to be able to find long-lasting solutions that will have a positive impact, a lasting impact in resolving any of these issues. Because if you're looking at the wrong problem, you're not going to be able to find the right solution for it. Simple as that. Now, when you talk about GameStop, for those of you who are not familiar, GameStop is a video game stock that shot up in price, went from like 20 or even under around $10 at one point, all the way up to $450 because a bunch of retail investors piled in because there were specifically 2 hedge funds that were short the stock heavily. The stock was very heavily shorted. The 2 hedge funds being Melvin Capital and Citron. And the whole narrative became this sort of like Robin Hood-like thing where finally the retail investors are going to screw these rich, wealthy hedge funds that's been playing Wall Street and screwing over the little guys for a long time, and now we're getting them back and potentially going to bankrupt them. And this narrative was first started off in Wall Street Bets on Reddit. Then it got propagated on the media because it was, a good story to tell, exciting story to tell. But again, the truth didn't really matter very much. And what I mean by this is when we're looking at this GameStop phenomenon, the two hedge funds that were caught in this position that became the villain of this narrative, they were not they did not become the villain because they were specifically targeted and they were specifically bad hedge funds, for example, or they were simply just in a bad spot and they were in a position to essentially get screwed. And because of that, they became the villains. So for example, Citron was a hedge fund, activist short hedge fund. They were responsible for actually calling out Valiant Pharmaceutical, which is one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies at the time, that was cooking their books, basically committing fraud. And they realized it and they called them out. They shorted the stocks, and they actively informed people, right? Talked about it in the media, eventually bring that company down and expose them. Again, right? But instead, they are now viewed as this villain hedge fund that represents rich Wall Street institutions in general. Another thing that people don't like to talk they don't talk about is that this narrative where retail investors versus rich hedge funds is fiction, because when the stock shot up to 400 whatever dollars, there's plenty of hedge funds that went long on this stock. When this started hitting the media and people started realizing what was going on, you better believe a ton of hedge funds jumped in on the opportunity to blow up these short hedge funds for personal financial gains. Like, take a look at here. BlackRock, which is one of the biggest financial institutions in the United States, in the world for that matter, may have raked in $2.4 billion from the GameStop pump frenzy. I'm sure you never heard of any of these other hedge funds. Maverick Capital, Shellback Capital, Landscape Capital, blah, blah, blah. They all made a bunch of money going long on on GameStop. And here's the sad thing. The sad thing is that when this thing is said and done, they say the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, meaning that the market can be irrational for a very long time. But at some point, it'll come back to reality. And when it comes to GameStop here, when things settle down and prices drop, who ends up being the ones holding these stocks? They're usually your retail investor, mom and pops, that got caught up in the situation and bought into it without knowing what it was, because they hear about it every day in the media, and they maybe even hear about it from their friends who maybe made 50%, 100% on stock, and they just, oh yeah, okay, get in on it because they tell them to get in on it. These long hedge funds here that got involved to go long, they're not gonna have any qualms when they realize that this is over at this point, like the narrative's gone, whatever. They're gonna sell their stock, take their profits, no problem. The people that end up holding this is gonna be retail folks, and they're the ones that's going to get hurt. And then you have all this discussion about I'm not gonna get into it, but Robinhood, the trading application and the conspiracy going around with it, which is not really fact-based either. But again, the media doesn't care. The people at Wall Street Bets don't care about that. They rather just continue on with this narrative. Let's blow up the shorts, the rich hedge funds people, and within this, you feel a palpable amount of anger, and the action is more like vengeance than anything else. It's not specifically targeted either. It's just whoever's in that position to get screwed, we get them. And I think when I look at GameStop, the phenomenon and the mob mentality, although that's online, and you look at Black Lives Matters, they're both the same in that way. At least they're very similar in that way. At the end of the day, it's wealth disparity. When you talk to people with Black Lives Matter, you ask them what the solution is, how can we make this better? What's the problem here? It actually doesn't. It's not so much race. It comes down to wealth disparity, right? And it's framed in a race way because they say more blacks due to previous circumstances resulted in poor communities, etc., or the war on drugs. This is mental gymnastic essentially to me to arrive at that conclusion. But anyhow, it's this is the whole narrative. It's like the oppressed and the oppressors, and that's the narrative that was painted in the GameStop phenomenon. That's the narrative that's being painted with Black Lives Matter movement. That's the narrative that's being painted overall with critical race theory, whether it's the LGBT community, like there's discrimination, oppressor, oppressed, very similar to what happened during the Cultural Revolution in China. And as I look more to it, especially this month, I see more and more analogies. You have statues being pulled down. You have statues being pulled down, whether that be George Washington's statue, people trying to deface churches. Um, what else? Churches. John A. Macdonald in Canada's head got decapitated. There's plenty. There's so much. Honestly, if you just did Google in there, you just Google a bit, you could list 20, 30 statues across countries, maybe even hundreds, that's been defaced, decapitated, pulled down for the mere under the pretense of racism, or they're oppressed any the minority groups that weren't white, right? What did you see in China during the Cultural Revolution? They burnt down palaces. They burned down anything that had any relation to the monarchy, the emperor, old traditional texts, tore them down, burnt them down. Same thing. Why? Because they represented the oppressors at the time. Cancel culture and um, self critique, right? Back in China and even in North Korea right now, they have regular self critique sessions when you say something maybe it's not as politically correct in that culture. Publicly get forced to apologize for it. We see the same thing happening in the West right now in the United States. Yet, what is kind of is troubling is because here's at the end of the day, it's the same also in China during the Cultural Revolution. And when you read about it, when you see it in documentaries and stuff, it seems like the whole country's gone to frenzy. And you hear about the most extreme examples where people are killed. But my point is that I guess my point is whether that be in China during the Cultural Revolution and probably in Soviet Union too as well. People have a very simplistic way to even look at it, what occurred during that time, because we look at it as in some ways they're like the bad guys, but the truth is nobody actually thinks they're the bad guy at the time. In China, people who were the Red Guards or supported the Red Guards, they thought they were fighting for the oppressors. They thought they were trying to change the world for the better, starting with their own country, but they wanted to spread it internationally as well. And they just wanted to eliminate anything that has representation of the oppressor. They were misguided. A lot of the Red Guards, for example, that are still alive today, feel very sorry for what they done, and they were indoctrinated, or through propaganda or whatnot, right? And I can't help but see the similarities in some ways. Now there's some differences, no doubt. In right now, when it's in the United States, it's more of a decentralized movement, coming from the bottom, grassroots. That's penetrated into the deepest level of government, the highest office. Whereas back in Cultural Revolution, it was more top down, and it was also a result of a political. It's honestly a topic for another time, but the energy is there, especially when you're talking about the masses of people. The energy is there, and the desire for vengeance is there. The lack of wanting to discuss these issues honestly, or look at alternative perspectives. There's it's similar in that way, and I would urge people to hopefully keep that in mind, because I think sometimes these things can make a drastic turn fairly quickly. I mean, one could argue we're just one financial crisis from significant social unrest. Um, and in the midst of all this, I think things can get very bad, because the quickest way to a police state is through anarchy. And I don't think that's what anybody wants to see, whether regardless of your political affiliations, black, white, yellow. I don't think that's what anybody wants to see. But there's the potential of heading into that direction if we are, as a community and society, are not careful. So I would urge people to just try to have a more open mind and engage in these conversations with people who don't necessarily agree with you. Sometimes they're uncomfortable conversations to have, but I think you should have them regardless. Just go in with good intentions. The conversation might get quite heated. You might end up swearing and cussing at each other, but at the end of the day, at the very least, even if you do not end up agreeing, both of you walk away completely disagreeing. But if you both go in there with good intentions, at the very least, you'll come out with a little bit more empathy. And that, I think, will help, if anything, to ease some of the hate and the anger. The most importantly, we should not be preventing other people to speak just because we don't agree with them. And that means don't try to disrupt other people's campus speakers that go to campuses to speak because you don't agree with them. Get people's publications removed and this and that. But I think I think I made my point for today. This is just my thoughts on the issue. Feel free to leave your comments below. I want to hear what you guys have to say as well, and have a discussion on this issue, like I said. So regardless, just leave your comments below if you have anything to say to it. I also, again, I realize that what I'm saying is a little bit, might sound like a large exaggeration, but sometimes when you're early on these things, when you speak on them too early, they also tend to sound a little radical and ridiculous. So I'll just urge you guys to keep that in mind. And but take care, guys, and all the best. Cheers.